Hey
Hey
Mr.
man, welcome.
Brass,
Do you want? Oh, there we go. There's the request. Awesome.
great to have you here. Me and Ryan been having a cool conversation.
So, how you guys been doing?
Feeling good, having a good night.
Good.
What have you guys been talking about? I heard a little bit about natural law coming in here. I was just taking a bath and I realized this stuff was on.
No, man. Very glad to have you. Yeah. I mean, I think. God, there's a lot to talk about. It's meeting of the Caliphate, so rare. But I think we were kind of talking about what deism is. Like,
Hmm.
like if you need to explain it to somebody, like, it's not atheism, but it's not theism. And the boundaries are not exactly cleanly drawn. So we were kind of talking about how to explain it and what ramifications that has.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is the whole deism.com website sort of thing, if you know what that is.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've read through that.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is I actually have my own article on there.
Oh, do you? That's awesome.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
cool. You should post that in the community so we can read it. I'd love to.
oh yeah. I have to look through it. It would be old, but it's there. Um,
Yeah, old internet day stuff. That's awesome. It's like just a small little sliver of corner of the giant internet over the last
Well,
20 years.
yeah, and
yeah.
it's much more meaningful once we know the person who wrote it. So that's awesome.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm. It's more about like the story section, like conversions and stuff like that. I believe on there, where I'd be on. But I generally do find their definition of deism to be like pretty basic, and I think most deists would concede to most of the points on that they give on it.
Let me
With
bring it up real quick.
yeah, well, I already have it up on my computer.
Hmm.
Um, Yeah, it's deism is the recognition of a universal creative force greater than that demonstrated by mankind, supported by personal observation of laws and designs in nature and the universe, perpetuated and validated by the innate ability of human reason, coupled with the rejection of claims made by individuals in organized religions of having special divine revelation.
That's an excellent definition.
Yeah,
Yeah,
If
that's
if
pretty cool.
if I was going to quibble with it, and I'm not, well, yeah, I think I will quibble with it. But this might be an interesting thing to talk about because I think if I read Alex correctly, I don't think he would make this quibble. So I think this might just be a difference in our opinions. I would probably replace rejection with coupled with like healthy skepticism.
mm,
Like as I read people like Thomas Paine and people like that, they never. I don't think they think that God is incapable of revelation or even incapable of miracle. Their point is, if you claim to have revelation, there is no way for me to verify that.
yeah,
So,
precise.
whether or not it happened isn't the issue. The issue is that I am unequipped with the tools to make an assessment of that.
Yeah,
I kind of like I like the line Alex O'Connor used in that recent Jubilee debate, where a woman was talking to him about personal revelation she had, and he
yeah,
immediately conceded. He was like, "Yeah, of course. If I had that revelation, I would become a Christian the next day. Of course, but I haven't
yeah.
had it, right?" So yeah, and I think that's where I would draw the line. But I do think there are deists who say flat stop. Revelation is false, which is probably more than I would go.
Um, for me, I also go with Thomas Paine in that sort of approach. I have a healthy degree of skepticism towards organized religions when it comes to that matter. I mean, I do recognize them in the sort of sociological sense, where, I mean, they've stayed around for, I don't know, tens of thousands or whatever, so there had to be some benefits of it for sociological reasons, but uh, in terms of the metaphysical claims that they make, that's sort of where I depart from them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, I was actually just rereading this very deistic letter by Benjamin Franklin, and he said basically what we've been saying, which is like, he has no qualms with Jesus as a moral teacher or even as a moral authority, and is quite interested in hearing those lessons, but has no way to know whether Jesus rose from the dead, and has no real plans to investigate it because it's not the kind of thing that he ever could know. So instead he's going to go about his life with the tools that he has and the capacities he has and try to resolve the problems in given those tools and capacities, which I think is more than fair.
Yeah. Alex has his hand up. What is he? I want to hear what he's going to say.
Oh, sorry, Alex. We're just free for
It's
all.
fine. Yeah, it's just I have a hard time cutting in. It's a
It's
I
fine.
just I prefer the hand raising thing.
It's fine.
What was
Go
I
ahead.
saying? What was I thinking? Oh yeah, so when you were talking about the word rejected, as I totally agree with what you're talking about. And I guess yeah, Thomas Paine did have the he rejected organized religion, not. I mean, he was all about the Enlightenment and having a God-given conscience and then having the freedom and liberty to use that conscience. And so if someone was doing that um, within the context of a revelation, then yeah, that's their experience and it should be honored. Um, so like the deist website with the word rejected is it kind of reminds me of anti-theism, basically, like which is usually an atheist term, but I guess it's possible to be an anti-theist deist. Yeah.
Um, in the sociological sense, I mean, I can definitely see someone not liking organized religion. I definitely see it having problems, especially. Although I do think some of the problems it has is also a plus to it. Um, like people underestimate how vital dogma is to people's lives.
Did you
Um,
did you say vital?
yeah, vital.
Oh yeah, no, I think
No, I would agree.
that is a very powerful point.
Yeah, because people in general, um, they sort like the thing is that these group structures are maintained through reinforcing beliefs and showing commitment and no group, whether it be religious or not, can hope to survive without some strong reinforcements of their beliefs. And dogmas happen to do that for the religious people.
I totally agree with you. And Alex and I spoke about this, so sorry for the repeat, Alex. I know you know my views about this, but I think it's worth talking about. I actually think you've pinpointed in that statement exactly why deism has not caught on, because I think the philosophy of it and the understanding of it is very appealing. And in fact, many people who would describe themselves as atheists or like Christians or Jewish are more properly described as deists in their worldview. But
Yeah,
deism has no myth and it has no dogma. And without myth and dogma and some structure to it, it doesn't exist. There's nothing for people to grab onto. So it has a hard time replicating, and it has a hard time establishing itself as an idea, even though, like, God, if I talk to my Jewish, I'm a New York City lawyer, so just not to stereotype, but I have a lot of non-practicing Jewish friends, and they are essentially deists to the man because they believe in God. They don't go to temple. They don't take particularly seriously the claims in their holy texts. They don't take particularly seriously rules like kosher, et cetera, et cetera. But they believe in God. They believe in natural law. They believe in order. They believe in objective morality. They believe in free will. Like, they're deists, but the label never stuck.
yeah. Alex has his hand up. What do you want to say,
Oh, sorry,
Alex?
Alex. I'm so sorry. I haven't been looking.
It's all good. I keep losing my thought. Sorry. So what I think is that the what I reject is the requirement of revelation. I mean, dogma is good, and there are things that are passed down that help people with their experiences, and there's a lot of weirdness out there. But ultimately, I think deism is about being all inclusive. So because it doesn't make that claim that you have to have revelation. It says you could have revelation, but you could also have reason. Like you don't. It's because there's a bunch of people out there, like Alex O'Connor for one, the non-resistant non-believer. It's like he's a person who's had a genuine human experience that lacks something that would be described as revelation. And so within those dogmas that you guys are talking about, they tend to be exclusionary and say, well, people with those ideas have lesser ideas. And then ultimately, what that kind of does is that kind of stratifies them into society, and that they end up being discriminated. It wasn't like what you were talking about. What you were talking about how, sorry, Brian was talking about the moral character of Jesus, and it's beautiful to speak of the stuff that he did and the amazing stories that come out of the Gospels, but that's just heresy as far as the church is or the traditional churches are concerned. It's just a heretical belief called moralism. It's like, oh my gosh, Christ was just a man that was like a badass. That's it. Like they used to punish people for those kinds of beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's pretty funny is that Thomas Paine gets a lot of hate for being anti-Christian, supposedly, but in reality, he was more anti-classist. What they call it? Not anti-classist. He was more against the priesthood and stuff like that. That was more of where he was against. He was against more the the higher orders of churches, and to be quite frank, he did have some legitimate reasons for being against them. He had churches that were ratting him out to the British government trying to get him executed. So, I mean, he was almost put to death in 2 different countries, and he managed to survive both. So, I mean, that just tells you a bit of the badass that Thomas Paine was.
His story ends so sadly, though, doesn't it?
I think relatively. I think a lot of times people over make it. Like, he definitely he lived. His
Do you know
best
what I mean
traits
by that?
his best traits were that he was a loudmouth who always spoke his mind. His negative trait was that he was a loudmouth that always spoke his mind.
That's great.
And yeah, so it was, so that kind of got him that, I mean, on one hand, it was a benefit because he was able to rally the revolutionary troops by his words and his writings. But on the other hand, it could also alienate people as well.
For sure, yeah. But did you know that he only 6 people went to his funeral?
It wouldn't surprise me, no.
Yeah, it's just a window into what happened to him. Basically became a pariah, and
Yeah.
didn't have any social connections. I mean, they ruined him by the end. And it's actually a really interesting thing to research of what the churches did, because what he did was he was a rabble rouser, and he did all of his writings were just crazy. I mean, they it kind of, when you read them, it kind of sounds like Christopher Hitchens. It's like, but you would take Christopher Hitchens and put him in the 18th century. It's like, holy crap! Like he was super brave,
Yeah.
but it came at a cost for sure.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting to think about because, and I think you guys both were alluding to this, but when Paine was writing, there was an imminent threat, not like a tangible, real, non-hypothetical threat of the clergy expressly wielding political power, which created a very potent form of tyranny. And
Yeah.
it would make absolute sense in that era for deists to be laser focused, as he was, on criticizing the nexus of religiosity and political power when formally melded in that way. Today, the landscape is so different. And I know I find myself, when I'm arguing about religion or stuff on X or in other spaces, like, in one breath, I'll be on the theist side, and in the next breath, I'll be on the atheist side. It really depends on the topic, because deism occupies an interesting middle ground in that regard. So if you're arguing about free will or objective morality, or the argument from reason for the, I'm gonna be siding with the theists. But if you're arguing that it should be an expressly Christian nation, you're going to lose me. Right. So, it's a very different world we find ourselves in.
And what's even funny, it was pretty obvious even when you read his Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason, that his criticisms was more towards, like he expressly says, it's more towards the clerics. Because he says in chapter 3, nothing that is here said can apply even with the most distant disrespect to the real character of Jesus Christ. He was a virtuous and amiable man. The morality that he preached and practiced was of the most benevolent kind, and those similar systems of morality have been preached by Confucius and by some Greek philosophers many years before, the Quaker sense and many good men in all ages. It has not been exceeded by any. So it's very clear in Paine's writing that he's making he's targeting governmental roles, and the clergy at the time was, I mean, for one, they were one of the people that were all on board trying to get him killed. So, I mean, yeah, sorry, he's not going to be the most generous person to you when you're trying to kill him.
Yeah, there was also a panel of religious people from different denominations, or I forget, was it different? I don't even know if there was different denominations back then, but there was a bunch of scholars, basically theologians, that got together and put together a retort to all of his writings. And it's fascinating to read them because it sounds exactly like you're listening to like William Lane Craig and John Lennox, and just like theologians of the day, divine command theory, reason being an argument for theism rather than deism, stuff like that. It's very interesting because in their minds, they got up in front of everyone and published their things, their retorts, and apparently the public believed them because he crashed and burned.
Well,
Yeah.
I think this is a very serious issue, which I was alluding to before, which is deism has the risk of being perceived as an empty bag. It's like, okay, you believe in God, so what? How is it practical? What are the practices? Where's the community? Who are the people? Who do I look up to? What are the stories that I tell? What are the signs and symbols? And one of the interesting things about gathering like-minded people online is that we can start thinking about how to address those issues. Because I think, you're right, Alex, that like to a certain extent, ideas are a popularity contest. And Thomas Paine's ideas were very unpopular. And the only way to fix that is to kind of build a coalition on some level.
Yeah, and there wasn't enough people back then. Deism was more of a academic. It was for people who valued academics, right? And correct me if I'm wrong here, but the average person back in the day was not going to have access to all of the the knowledge of the day, right? They would be more like like a lower socioeconomic class. Is that a fair way to say it?
I don't know, but I would assume that that's right. That sounds right intuitively.
Because when you look at all the historical deists, they're in a certain level, right? Like it's like Maslow hierarchy of needs, where once you get to a certain level where your certain needs are taken care of, then you actually can sit down and start thinking about the meaning of life, you know, and thinking about like not just the meaning of life, but like using reason to map out, you know, the fabric of reality and trying to figure out what is the best way to look at reality and that kind of stuff. Those kind of things aren't really what you think about when you have to like fight for food, you know. So it would be easier for people who are in more dire straits in their lives to just accept the status quo and to be like, okay, yes, Jesus died for my sin, yes, Christianity is the way, and then just be cohesive, right? And then something like deism comes along and just kind of like doesn't really touch that. I don't know if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah. And I mean, what's also good to know is that there have always been disputes within deism. Like, for example, to go back to Thomas Paine, I mean, one of the reasons why he was going to get killed in France, like they wanted to execute him, was because he spoke out against this cult of God, which was a deistic cult in France. Um, and it was led by Maximilien Robespierre, and basically Paine's entire criticism of it was that while he understood them going after the king, he didn't agree with them executing the king, and he didn't agree with because they were pretty much by the tens of thousands just sending people to the guillotine, um, just for the crime of being against their cult, and that's sort of so. I mean, that's always been something that Paine was not afraid to go against whatever government was of his day if he felt that they were being against people's natural rights, that he would be perfectly willing to put his neck on the line, sometimes literally, to achieve his ends. And a lot of Paine's morality comes from his Quaker upbringing.
Ah, Quaker upbringing. That's interesting. I haven't done much research into that.
Yeah,
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 I think that's an interesting task that kind of falls to us as modern day deists, which is, at least to me, it's obvious that like the American founding was influenced by deism in a way which is fairly unique in that there were express and open deists involved in a political theory conversation about how to create a nation. And natural law is all about the concept of how do you create the ideal circumstances for humans to live. So I think there's a lot of lessons about what natural law is and isn't that can be taken from the U.S. founding, just because the people who were really involved in the thought process, we can kind of see what their conclusions were. But you know, the, I guess it falls to us to put meat on that bone. Where when someone says, oh, "Okay, so you're a deist, you believe in natural law. What is that?" Like we need to be able to have an answer. Not It's not going to be as crystal clear as read the New Testament, but we have to have something, because if it's just an empty bag, then we know we're not really explaining ourselves well, or explaining why the idea has any utility to anybody.
yeah. That, it makes sense by that, and I was attracted to deism purely from an academic standpoint. That's what really got me into it because I'd been going into research on religions at the time, and I was an agnostic for a time being, and I eventually just found a lot of deist resources, um, along with David M. Roberts, and some of his podcasts, and he's a deist as well. And I just sort of started doing that sort of research, and I eventually just became a deist uh, over time.
That's actually a super interesting topic. I know, Alex, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit, but maybe we should all share what drew us to deism, because that's kind of an interesting starting point for these conversations.
Yeah, it is. Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So I was agnostic, and then eventually, and I was kind of caught up in the new atheist movement. And I became an atheist because, and I started self-identifying as an atheist because I thought, based on what I was hearing and the information I was taking in, that the only worldview, so to speak, that values evidence the most is an atheistic perspective, or an agnostic. But I felt like there was no at that time I felt like there was no distinction between atheism and agnosticism. So I started self-identifying as an atheist and start living as an atheist. Basically, like, there is no meaning, there is no purpose. Life is what we make it, and just kind of try to, you get one life and try to build it, and I was living that life, and through that life, I mean, my entire life has been chock full of strange happenings, things that I just have to be like, okay, whatever. That's like one of the craziest coincidences ever, but let's just chalk that up to chaos in the universe, like, and there's ways to rationalize it, but that's what I kind of felt myself doing in my mind, was trying to rationalize my atheism. So I had looked at deism beforehand and kind of rejected it for the kind of more classical, standard reasons, where it's like, well, there's not enough evidence for it, so why would you believe it, kind of mentality. But I just always found myself having to rationalize that. And so now that I'm a deist, I don't find myself having to rationalize it. To me, deism is more something that would be cool to share with people, who may be having trouble, because there's a lot of people that were like me, because I was both a theist and an atheist, because I started out as a Christian. That was what I was raised as. So I have that experience of being a disaffected theist, as someone who loses their faith and has to reconstruct their worldview. And then deism came in as an option there. And then I also have the experience as being a disaffected atheist, someone who can't help but see the purpose to everything. That not necessarily understand it, but be able to infer that, like, that weird strangeness to reality, that purpose behind everything. And then, once I got to that point, like, I don't I feel at peace, and I would like to help other people, with it at that point, because if I didn't do that, then it would just be something that I researched some time, and to me, deism points me to the natural world. Like, once, for me, it's like I'm a deist, and that means that makes the world so much more interesting, to study. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, yeah. And also, I was just going to say, in other news, like, I know you talked to Destiny, Ryan. It looks like he's going to need to be talking to you more soon.
The real irony of that conversation, not that I knew what was going to happen, is my opening was, I'm here to talk about fundamental, neutral, constitutional principles and why I think they matter. And if Destiny followed fundamental, neutral principles, he'd be in a whole lot less trouble.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm just saying, don't be surprised if you get another call and he's saying, "Hey, you want to have another conversation?"
Yeah, maybe he'll say, "Hey, maybe I can throw you some money and you can get me out of trouble."
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid for him. I honestly am. It's pretty nasty.
No, I mean, honestly, it's an interesting object lesson because, for the record, I talk to him because I've enjoyed his content. And I enjoy his content because I think he engages, not always, but often, with ideas at a level that is a little bit higher than the typical internet discourse. And I appreciate that.
Well,
But
he
I
uses
remember,
rationality a lot, right? Wouldn't that be a good
yeah,
way to put it?
he at least tries to come to a good conclusion, and work through the facts and work through the logic. But I remember, and as it relates to this recent fall from grace, I remember when he was talking about abortion, and his position is that basically, in order for you to be a human life worthy of moral dignity, and therefore you have moral worth, you have to have had both the capacity for future experiences and past experiences, and that rules out essentially all fetal life. And as he was saying it, it struck me that I was like, well, this is a very thought out argument. Like, he's thought about it, he knows where the pitfalls are, and he knows this definition is going to be hard to challenge. But I don't think he believes there's any truth to it. I don't think he's saying this because he believes there is an objective moral fact of the matter and he has discovered what it is. I think he just picked whatever would make the argument work. And
Well,
that's very different. Like, if you actually believe in objective morality, you're trying to discover what the right answer is, not pick the convenient answer. And I think that's the problem ultimately with his species of moral relativism, is that it's too convenient.
Yeah, well, he has called himself, like they call him, an emotionalist.
Oh God, yeah, I know. Alex O'Connor does that too, and it makes me fucking cringe. But yeah,
Oh,
Yeah,
emotivism. Emotivism is what you're saying.
it's emotivism. Where, I mean, in case anyone doesn't know what that is, it's basically the idea that moral statements are basically like whenever someone makes a moral statement, like let's say murder is wrong, they're making more of an emotional plea, like they're saying boo murder.
yeah.
Yeah. Basically, morality is an experience and isn't tied to reason, right?
Well, it would be more tied to emotional states than it would be to purely logical states. I would assume that's what emotivism would entail.
Yeah, and it isn't an emotion more of an experience than an argument. There's not argumentation to emotion. It's more instinctual. It's more there's a tiger rustling in the bushes kind of thing.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, but
Um,
for me, and look, I mean, there's some very smart people who disagree, so I don't claim to have resolved the argument. But for me, the counter blow from people like C.S. Lewis or Alvin Plantinga, who, oh, actually, I've heard John Lennox make this argument too, where the argument basically is it's self-defeating at a certain point to say that humans are incapable of reason or that our capacities aren't reasonable in these areas. So if your position is we're wrong about morality, like it might feel like it's moral, but it's really just an emotional impulse like boo murder. We're wrong about free will. We think we have it, but we don't really. We're just deterministic boxes, moving through the world in this way. You know, we might even be wrong about rationality itself. In fact, our brains are just evolved matter. We evolved from apes. It's our minds are products of our brains, and therefore our minds serve the goals of evolution, not the goal of truth seeking. So to the extent we have any thoughts, it's only because it's adaptive that we have them, not because they represent anything true. If you believe those things, then why should I believe anything else that you say? Because if all those things are true, then humans aren't capable of finding truth through reason or argument. And if I apply that to you making these claims, I should ignore them. I think it's really dangerous to assume that humans are fundamentally illusioned and wrong about their capacity to understand themselves and the world. It strikes me as, to steal a page from our theist friends, full of hubris.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that antithetical to a lot of the central theist claims that that revelation is required? Because if revelation was required, then that implies that we are not enough.
Well, I think theism walks a fine line there, right? Because on one hand, obviously, revelation is required to the extent that you're talking about what God intends, or meant or did or said. That's, I think, core theism. But on the other hand, theism says that, man is created in God's image, and God is all good and all powerful. So since we're created in God's image and he's all good and all powerful, he wouldn't deceive us. So if we feel like we have free will, and if we feel like there are moral imperatives, that we're not mistaken, because that would be antithetical to the core doctrines that they have. So they are threading a needle there, but I don't think they would say that we're mistaken about these core aspects of humanity.
Yeah. When it comes to free will myself, I fall generally more into I've become more in line with the more compatibilistic range on that topic. And I do think to a certain extent, like in our everyday lives, we care more about the facts of the matter than we do specifically how they came about in a process. Like, for example, like most of us, when we look at a watch, we are not, we don't have anything in our mind that's wanting to know how the watch is doing what it's doing. What we're mainly concerned with is the watch giving us the right time? And that's a sort of, in terms of epistemology, that would range in the reliabilist camp. So I think that even when I've even made this sort of argument where everyone here has watched the Terminator movies, right?
Yeah, except for the last one, I think.
Well, yeah, but I mean, there's always been a debate among fans of the Terminator whether or not the machines have free will. Because on one hand, it's very clearly that they're robotic and they're following a program, but on the other hand, they do have moments where they seem to be acting outside of what they were programmed to do. And so there has been a big debate over whether or not they have free will. But here's the thing. When it comes to our legal system, like if you have a robot that is trying to kill lots of people with a gun, like the first thing that we're going to be thinking about is how to stop and contain that robot, not whether or not dealing with the philosophical questions of whether or not the robot has free will or not.
Yeah, that's after the fact. That's when the dust is settled. Then you can start thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, like that's more like after the fact. Like we care more like sort of not in the moment about it. And I also am like this. It's sort of like people will use determinism to go against the death penalty. And like I said, I'm not like anyone that's against it. I perfectly get why people are against it. But an argument I've never gotten like against it was the whole deterministic argument against it, where the idea is that the death
Against what?
penalty
Sorry.
is the deterministic argument against the death penalty,
Oh,
where
against the death
the yeah, where it's the idea that it is not right to sentence someone to death for a process that was outside of their control. Like they were geared by the Big Bang to be like a murderer or a rapist, so it's unfair to punish them for that. And that's sort of the argument, but my response to that is, well, yes, it is true that like if determinism is the case, the man had no option but to be like a murderer, a rapist, or whatever. But also, that would equally mean that we as a society who put him to death also could not do differently either.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
Well, but yeah, see, this is, it's funny. Part of my rationale for deism was my belief in free will.
yeah,
Like free will is so hard to square with atheism, or sorry, just to be more precise, because I say atheism all the time because I'm arguing with people on X and I'm just playing into the norms here. But like what I mean is atheism is so hard to square with material naturalism as a philosophy that
yeah,
it's basically impossible. But of course, the second you bring any form of supernaturalism in,
mhm,
it's on the table, right? So I'm curious, in a worldview that includes God, why? What are your concerns about free will?
mhm,
Because, like, the typical arguments are, at least when I talk about free will, it's talk to someone who's a naturalist, and they say like, well, all you have is your brain, and your brain creates your mind, and your brain is full of chemicals and neurons that follow the laws of physics. And maybe there's some quantum randomness mixed in there, but that's not free will either. So there's no way you could have free will because you're limited to this slab of meat, and this slab of meat is governed by the laws of physics.
mhm.
Um, but if you bring the supernatural into the equation, even a little bit, then that's not necessarily true. So I'm very curious about your perspective on that.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're a lawyer, so you'd have more inside knowledge on this. But from what I have gathered and from what I have read, the legal system does sort of presuppose a compatibilistic model where compatibilists say that free will is, you can have free will and determinism as one. And the way that they square that is that while you're not held accountable for your action per se, but what you're held accountable for is your knowledge when doing an action. Whether or not, you were predetermined to do the action or not, it is a fact of the matter if you have the knowledge to do it. Um, for like, for example, to give an example of this, we have the insanity plea, or like disabilities, like people that are just insane or try to plead insanity, where the question in our mind may not be, did these people do it? We might completely know that they did it. The question would be, did they know that they were doing wrong at the time that they did it? It could be the case that they could not help them but to do the crime that they were doing. But the thing is that we're asking is, did they know what they were doing? Not whether or not they could have stopped themselves from doing it.
Yeah,
If that makes
I see what you're saying. Like, yeah, in the law, when they ask about, like, they call it mens rea, which is like the guilt, translates to the guilty mind.
yeah,
Yeah, there are questions like that. Did you know what was happening? Was it foreseeable?
mhm,
In insanity defenses, did you understand what was happening around you, or even did you have control over yourself? Or would be questions that would be raised.
yeah,
But I was even more asking it on a fundamental level. Like,
yeah,
I guess for me, and maybe this is like a very simplistic argument, but I go through life experiencing choices. Like, I make a choice, and I very much believe I could have made a different choice. Sometimes I
mhm,
don't make the right choices, but I believe I could have. And of course, even on compatibilism, you couldn't have. You might think you could have, but you're wrong. Like, you rationalize it, but you actually couldn't have made a different choice. And of course, it's impossible to prove that you could have made a different choice because we don't have time machines. But that's the experience I have, and it's such a powerful experience that I feel like I would need an overwhelming amount of evidence to convince me to the contrary. Like I'm not even sure what the evidence would be that would convince me to the contrary, because that's just how life feels to me. So I don't know. Like the compatibilist view never appealed because it felt like it wasn't in line with that core experience.
Yeah. I mean, I completely get that. I mean, in case people don't know, there's really three schools of thought. Well, I mean, there's possibly more, but three main schools of thought when it comes to free will. There's straight up determinism. There's, well, wait, four, but I count, like, there's fatalism, determinism, compatibilism, and libertarianism. Fatalism is different from determinism because in order to be a fatalist, you have to be a theist, because a fatalist is someone that believes you are fated by the gods to do what you do. So it's instead of the natural law that's keeping you determining you, it would be the gods essentially. That's sort of like Greek mythology sort of thing, but that's generally like four main views of it. Compatibilism is more so the idea that free will can be made do with free will, and determinism could work together in line. I generally go more in that area. But I also say that it is more of a philosophical thing that I go for. And it's not so much as the ethics of it, because when it comes to my ethical system, I go more by intent. And regardless of where your intent came from, the fact is you still have the intent. Like, it's sort of like, for example, if someone commits a school shooting or something, you could completely analyze the person down to their fundamental relationships in their lives, and you can determine that their intentions come from, let's say, I don't know, a long stream of abuse, like an abusive family, and they're lashing out against everyone else for that. But even then, we know that knowing where the intent came from doesn't really, in our minds, justify what the person did, and the person will still likely be held accountable for that.
So that's really so. This is fascinating. I mean, I don't know if I don't want to force us into a
Philosophical debate.
a deep dive on this one particular topic, unless that's what we want to do. I'm definitely an incompatibilist.
Yeah.
So I'm unconvinced by the squaring of the circle, let's say, and and I think it's interesting because I think it has real world impact. I was talking about this in a space recently, but I was listening to Sam Harris talk, and I enjoy listening to Sam Harris talk because I think he's a reasoned thinker, even when I disagree with him. And he was saying, basically, if we had a perfected science of the mind, if we had everything mapped out in the brain, and we had all the proper scientific tools, we could use those tools to make people want to do better things. So the person who, to your point, intended to do something bad could now intend to do something good. And wouldn't we all be better off in that scenario? And I felt this existential dread because the idea that you are, for the greater good, invading someone's mind and rewiring it to prefer other things seems like such an enormous violation of natural law, but just also the kind of like the sovereignty and sacredness of an individual. But a lot of that comes from my belief in free will, because I think that they actually have the right to make choices, and they could make better choices if they wanted to. Now, if they were sufficiently motivated. Now, if I didn't believe that, if I thought that they really couldn't control their choices, then I'm not sure why he's wrong. Because wouldn't we all be better off if they made better choices? Yeah. And they can't control their choices now. So what difference is it if we control their choices? They weren't controlling them in the first place. We didn't take anything away from them.
Well, yeah. Well, that goes into a big ethical debate over consequentialism and deontology and virtue ethics, sort of stuff like that.
Yeah, you're correct.
If someone's a deontologist, it would be that even if you could show me with 100% certainty that you could control someone's, like, let's say society would be better off if we controlled these people's brains or whatever, it would still go against, let's say, if you have a Kantian more of deontology, where you would not be justified in being moral, even if you could show with 100% accuracy that things would be better off because you would be committing an egregious wrong. And in deontology, the ends don't justify the means.
Yeah, and Alex and I were talking about this before you joined, but I think it's actually where we were when you joined. To me, deontology or contractualism, like behind the veil of ignorance, are the proper ways to try to ascertain what natural law is. Yeah. I don't think consequentialism works for that project. Though I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts as to ethical systems, because I hope that obviously is a big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Well,
oh, you go, Alex.
Oh, yeah. I was curious about Sam Harris's thought experiment where you could change the intention of someone, and to me that sounds like squaring the circle, because if you change someone's intention, then their intention is now your intention, so they don't have an intention. So basically, what you've done is you've killed them. That's the way that I would look at it. Is it now they're a zombie that you control, so you essentially killed them, which I think is a bad thing.
And there are Frankfurt examples, like when it comes to the free will thing, where it can show that even if you could not have done otherwise, you could still be morally wrong in something. Like a typical example that I hear in the literature is, let's take an example of Mike, the animal abuser. He likes to kick dogs. That's his favorite thing to do. And when Mike is asleep, an evil scientist goes into his brain and puts a chip in there where the next time he sees a dog, if he plans on not kicking it, the chip will turn on and make him kick the dog. However, if he decides to just kick the dog anyway, the chip won't turn on. Well, in that case, he could not have technically done differently. He was going to kick the dog one way or the other. But we would generally see it as more morally wrong if the switch did not flip and he still kicked the dog than if the switch had flipped and he kicked the dog.
Yeah, if the switch flipped, he's not morally responsible at all. If the flip did not switch, he's completely morally responsible.
Yeah. And that's sort of the whole, that would be an example of, what's they call it, that's he couldn't do otherwise because of how the chip is operated. If he decided not to kick the dog for whatever reason, the chip would make him kick the dog. And if he decided to kick the dog, well, the chip wouldn't do anything. So he technically couldn't do any differently.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought experiment, dude. I've never heard that before.
I mean, you'd be surprised about the rabbit hole of literature I had to go down because I wrote 2 books, and one was more philosophical than the other one, and so I got down to a big rabbit hole of ethics and stuff like that. And yeah,
Did you publish?
the help with them.
Did you publish?
No, I never could figure out how to do through Amazon, but I have sold them through my Cash App. Like
Oh, okay.
someone gives me $5 and I send it to them in their email.
Yeah, because that's a whole quagmire, isn't it? Right? Like trying to
Yeah,
figure out how to get ideas out there. You know, because
yeah,
it's like one thing coming up with the idea, and that's hard enough. The
yeah,
next is like, how do you get a distribution stream where people actually? This is really near and dear to my heart. It gives me the warm fuzzies when you say that because my uncle is this fascinating figure. He's he kind of dissented from the Vietnam War, and instead of fighting, he gave up his U.S. citizenship and went to India and studied with like Hindu masters and yoga and this whole thing, and changed his name to Hum, which means heart. And anyway, eventually, like all the other people who didn't participate in the war, he was, the sanctions were lifted. I think he was pardoned. I forgot which president did it, but they rescinded all the consequences. But he still stayed in Canada, and obviously he's a really interesting, thoughtful guy, and he kind of lives like a monk on the side of a mountain, and he writes these books that are sometimes good, sometimes bad. I've liked some of them and not others, but they're always interesting. But that's always the rub, right? Is he writes the book, and then we're like, okay, well, you sent us copies, but like, what do we do now? Like, how do we, what's the next step? And that's fucking hard. And writing the book's hard enough, So I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Is like, how do we get deistic ideas traction, such
yeah.
that a book like yours would be something that someone would be interested in publishing?
Well, I mean, from what I have heard, people liked it generally what I wrote,
Mhm.
and I mean, it was sort of funny because it was originally. I mean, I did know I wanted to be an author one day, but I never knew what I would exactly write about. And I'm the kind of guy. Whenever I read books, I take notes naturally. And what I found out is like I had this big spreadsheet of like literally must be like hundreds of pages worth of citations from different books and stuff that I've gotten. And I realized I had enough material in that document to write at least 2 books. And it was basically it took me 5 years, I think, to collect all like it was like 5 years of reading and taking notes that led to that. Eventually, me cobbling it together in order to make 2 coherent books. Because I mean, I don't claim to be an original writer at all, but I consider myself more is I take the literature that's already out there on the matter and I try to simplify it so that the layman can understand it.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Well, and
And the third,
I think that's actually like honestly kind of exactly the project I'm interested in right now. Earlier, we were talking about theism and the Bible and dogma, and one of the things that I think really works about Christianity in particular is that they have a set of stories, and those stories work. Like if you take them totally literally and you don't think about it a lot, you just take it literally, you're going to fit into a religious community. It's going to make your life better. Now, if you take them metaphorically, there's a lot to unpack and you'll probably get more out of it. And if you take it philosophically, you'll probably get even more out of it. but they work even at the basic level, like like you were saying, at the layman level. And I think that's
Yeah.
really important because like we were saying before, like in Thomas Paine's era, all the deists were these kind of hyper-educated statesmen because you had to be. It didn't even make sense if you weren't at that level. So coming up with
Yeah.
ways to make it accessible to people who aren't, like, in our era, like, how do you make deism into a meme so people see it and they're like, oh yeah, I vibe with that, but they don't have to be mega interested in reading philosophy texts to understand what it is and why it might appeal to them.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good at making memes. I haven't been able to translate that successfully into deism, but I mean, hey, I could always get ideas and figure out how to do that and mix them up.
So you want to
'Cause I do have a
you want to be chief meme maker for Project Deism?
yeah. I mean, I
Nice.
could try to do that. I mean, if I can get the material and could figure it out, I would, because I mean, I make memes for everything else. I don't know why I wouldn't do deism if I could. If I
Can I
could,
ask you a
because it's
real basic question? What software do you use?
I use Photoshop for for my drawings and stuff that I make, and for my video editing, I use Adobe Premiere.
All right, I gotta bite the bullet and spend some money on software.
Well, I can't help but also bring up the fact that uh, in today's day and age, podcasts are a really good thing, and it's a way to just to propagate information, and people are used to it. A lot of people listen to long form content nowadays, and that's also a good opportunity to, because if you get an audience, social media and podcasts and stuff, that gives you a way to market something like a book or a blog or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly why I did the Destiny thing. Didn't quite go the way I planned, but that's why I did it. And yeah, I totally agree with you. That's one of those things that's like it's really slow going till it's not, right? Like something pops and then you have an audience, and until that
Yep.
happens, you kind of don't know what's gonna do. I think it's really useful to try to cultivate relationships with, like, to use the kind of like social media lingo, like just bigger accounts who are operating in this space. I know Darwin to Jesus is annoyed with you, apparently, Alex. I don't know why. Maybe you guys have mended fences. I'm not sure. I'm probably going to do a space with him next week. But I think we should be looking for more people who kind of want to talk religion and philosophy and have a platform and see if we can start some conversations.
Well, it's interesting because Darwin's whole thing is essentially revelation. I mean, I've been reading him for about a year and a half, and tangoing with him and sparring with him, and unfortunately, I like the guy, but I disagree with him so much. So it seems like I'm very oppositional, and I think that gets to him over time, because I just don't agree with him with a bunch of his stuff, and I think it has something to do with the fact that his worldview is so antithetical to deism, because he's always making the argument that eventually leads to revelation, is that you need the Bible. Like, the Bible is God's revelation to man, and that's why the earth is 6,000 years old.
Yeah, I agree with you. He definitely does believe in revelation and lean into it. It's interesting because it kind of depends what post you're interacting with on some level. Like when he's talking about the flaws of atheism, or when he's talking about arguments in favor of the existence of God, that's generally when I agree with him, because, or even when we talk about natural law, because those are all deistic arguments. But when he starts talking about specific revelation, that's obviously a Christian argument, and that's kind of where I get off the train.
Yeah, he uses the William Lane Craigs and the Frank Turek's, and and all of those teachers are essentially what he propagates. It's all of those deistic arguments that lead, that is basically a primer for then, and that's why you need this book.
Yeah. And the funniest thing about it is that a lot of these arguments were made by people like Greek philosophers that would hardly be how you could say Christian compatible. I know the Kalam cosmological argument in particular was made by Muslims
Yep.
first. And I know the first cause sort of arguments were made by pagan Greeks. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of the best arguments for God come even before Christianity or come outside of a Christian culture.
Oh, I mean,
I would say,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah. Oh, it's okay. I said that a thing that does get me a bit riled up when it comes to deism, I think that makes it inaccessible. It's not like a criticism against deism or academia and so much, but just how marketing is, where like all the good books that would actually be useful for the layman to read, they're completely either blocked off by a paywall and with or in sometimes with special clearance you have to have in order to get the book, or they make the book ridiculously high in price to where it almost costs you an arm and a leg to get the book. Like I go for like this one book that I've been looking forward to do studies with is called Scripture and Deism: The Biblical Criticism of the 18th Century British Deist. And can you guess how much money that the book cost?
120.
Oh, that sounds expensive. I shudder to guess.
It's $94
Yeah.
on
I'm
Amazon.
good at the prices right.
Yeah. That's the new one. I mean, you could obviously get a little bit cheaper if you get used, but that's still like $64, obviously plus shipping and handling. So yeah, you're paying almost at minimum you're paying almost $70 for a book that I mean, I think if like from the way it looks, it gives a lot of good information about deistic history and anthropological origins and stuff like that. But for typical people that don't have like jobs where they can just do that sort of thing,
You're breaking up,
yeah,
Brass.
they're pretty much sort of literature.
Is he breaking up for you, Ryan? To me, it sounds like
yeah, he was, but I think I got the gist.
Yeah,
Honestly, Brass, because you have this kind of, some of these like lengthy documents where you have all these sources cited and you've already compiled it. Two things immediately came to mind. One
yeah,
is if you'd be willing to share any of that, I would love to look at it, because I think
yeah,
compiling a central database of sources that we've like all read and looked at and kind of like have a shared understanding of would be a hugely valuable first step in our project.
love that idea.
And the second piece of that is we really should put together a library. Like once we've gone through the sources and we've kind of like figured out which ones we like and don't like, a very worthy project would be to assemble all these books and get a library together and just make sure that we're preserving them.
And then add to it.
Which would then that would serve as exactly, and that would almost serve as a what I think of is I mean, as you saw if you watched the Destiny thing, I'm an originalist when it comes to constitutional interpretation. And Justice Scalia compiled a library of sources from the time of the founding and again from the time of the adoption of the 14th and 15th Amendment, so that when someone asked him, well, what did this thing mean back then, he had a curated set of sources with an understood meaning that could answer that question, and which I think is really valuable when you're trying to define what your worldview is.
Personally, for me, like when it comes to the matters of like, I get people on both the conservative side and the liberal side that hate my interpretation of it, where I think the 14th Amendment was, in my opinion, like the current reading of the 14th Amendment is basically egalitarianism. That's basically the current interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which, when you really break it down, when you interpret the 14th Amendment in an egalitarian way, I mean, it pretty much nullifies the 10th Amendment, because essentially what the federal government can do is it can simply declare that something is a right to the citizens or whatever, and just simply overrule the states.
I mean, yeah, you're not going to get any argument from me. Obviously, if you, I don't know if you watch the conversation or not, but I in my temperament, I lean quite left. Like I prefer to have a society that has a lot of the things that the left tends to want. But that doesn't mean I think that they are rights. And that doesn't mean I think the Constitution says they're rights, because the Constitution is a legal document.
Yeah.
And what the legal document says is what it was understood to say when people wrote it. And what I really don't like is the idea of the separation of powers that our founders very carefully delineated being upset, because when a judge reads something into the Constitution that isn't there and says, this new right I'm going to announce, what they're basically, everyone applauds because they say, oh, how wonderful, we have a new right. But in reality, what they've done is that they've removed that question from the democratic process. And I don't think judges have the authority to do that. I think their authority is to interpret the legal document, but I don't think they get to invent new rights because they think it's a good idea. There's lots of things I think are good ideas.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they're rights. And because I'm not your king, and neither are the Supreme Court justices. But that's a bit of a tangent. But yeah, that's the.
Yeah. And for me, just from my basic reading of the Civil War and even going into Jim Crow and stuff like that, to me, it makes no sense to interpret the 14th Amendment as like an egalitarian amendment, because people have to remember this: both before, during, and after the 14th Amendment, immediately, there were laws in both the North and South that discriminated against people. And apparently, none of the people that were ratifying it and discussed the 14th Amendment ever saw any conflict between the 14th Amendment and having discriminatory laws on the book. Now, I think that obviously I'm against the discrimination stuff, and I'm morally opposed to it, but being morally opposed to something and having a legal backing for it is two completely different matters.
Yeah, and look, I'm a big believer in what's called res judicata. So when a legal issue has been decided, it shouldn't be changed absent some extraordinary test being satisfied. And that's really important, because if you keep changing what the law is and the judges keep changing their mind, there is no rule of law left. It just becomes kind of random chaos, and no one believes that the law is a real thing. And it's very dangerous, and you shouldn't do that. So look, there's been a lot of interpretation of the 14th Amendment, and some of it's gone beyond the text. I don't think that stuff needs to be reversed because I would have decided it differently. But I do think judges should stop inventing new stuff. You can't look at it, and there's I'm using this term again. I find myself using it a lot recently. There's a hubris to that, where you say, like, okay, well, I'm so wise because I've been appointed to the Supreme Court that I think the Constitution means whatever I think it ought to mean. And I don't think that's what lawyers do. I think lawyers are supposed to be looking at a legal document and use legal reasoning to ascertain its meaning. I don't think what we think is the best idea should factor in. We should try to limit, or we should try to factor it out as much as possible. Sorry, Alex, your hand is up, and I'm monopolizing, so I'm going to mute.
It's okay. It's okay. I just wanted to say that what you're saying is, it seems just so quintessentially American to me. And correct me if I'm wrong on this history, because I might be, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. Um, it's that up until FDR, there was term limits for presidents. And there wasn't term limits, sorry, no term limits for presidents up until FDR, because he won 4 times in a row, and then eventually they had to do something to keep the king from the the king kind of paradigm happening, the monarchy. But what you're talking about is you're setting aside your ideas. Like you keep saying it, you keep going, it doesn't matter what I think. Of course I'm going to think my idea is a good idea because I had it, and so, but you're able to detach yourself from that. And I think that that's quintessentially American, which is exemplified by like George Washington's presidency for 4 years. And so after the first 4 years of George Washington's presidency, he could have ran for a third term, but he didn't. He just passed the torch to John Adams, and so that speaks to that methodology, that ideology of, doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't, like that's the old way. I don't know if that makes sense or is historically valid or not.
No, it does.
I'm pretty sure it does.
There's a beautiful story I love telling, which is, because Scalia, we live in an era of extreme politicization. So, if you talk about originalism, everyone assumes that you're as far right as they come, and I'm more politically homeless than anything. But so I talk about Scalia a lot, so I like to tell this story, which is, he was a very conservative man. If you look at his personal views and his religious views, and his wife was even more conservative than he was. And there was a case called Texas v. Johnson, which asked the question, do you have a First Amendment right to burn your own American flag? And there was a split on the court, and the liberals were saying, yes, you do. And the conservatives were saying, no, you don't. It's anti-American. But Scalia is an originalist. So he looked at the First Amendment, and it obviously protects the right to burn your own flag. Of course, it's protected speech. It's political speech. It's the definition of what the founders wanted protected. So he was the deciding vote. And because of his vote, you have a protected right to burn your own American flag. But this wasn't his preference. If it was up to him, like if he was king, all flag burners would be in jail. He hates flag burners. In fact, the way he tells the story is that the next day he went to breakfast and his wife was humming, "It's a grand old flag. It's a high-flying flag," as a form of passive-aggressive retribution to let him know what she thought of his decision. But that's the point, that he believed in a principle, and the principle required a different outcome in this situation. So his preference, to your point, Alex, didn't matter.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a good example, because he would have hated that, and I'm sure George Washington would want his ideas, his administration, to keep going, because the next administration was going to be different. They were going to make different decisions. They were going to have a different style, and that is totally the opposite of a monarchy, which tries to hold on to, the king for as long as possible, right? Or queen.
Yeah, pretty much so. And America very much didn't. Washington and the other founders, they did not like the idea that someone could just inherit their power, like their authority. They believed that you had to earn your authority, and that's sort of why they hated monarchy. That's especially why Thomas Paine hated monarchy. He thought the idea that some rich dude who grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth and just happened to be born to the right people should get to dictate everyone else's lives was absurd to him.
Well, this is where I see.
Amen.
Oh, go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
So I just said amen to that.
Yeah. Well, and this is where I see the kind of like the fingerprints of deism on the founding is if you believe in natural law but not revelation, that means that you think that there is an ideal way for humans to live, but you're not sure what it is. So what do you do? What would you do to promote that? You would set up a system that makes tyranny impossible, because you know tyranny prevents the discovery of natural law. And then you would set up a system that allowed for experimentation, where the states could do things meaningfully differently. And we would have a federal system where we could try to come together on other issues. And that through this process that's messy and often very frustrating, we could try to work this out and allow for different options, and maybe even come to the conclusion that there is no answer in one space. Maybe there's an answer about the First Amendment, but maybe there's no answer about the political issue of the day. And maybe Connecticut and Delaware are just going to be different. And the answer is that people should get to pick where they live. And if you are concerned about that issue, go to Delaware where they agree with you. Because maybe not everything has one answer. Maybe some things require flexibility. That to me looks like a deist solution. It certainly doesn't look like a Christian solution, because if you believe in revelation, there would be one answer and you wouldn't need this level of flexibility.
Yeah, you wouldn't need an experiment.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
The experiment is the fingerprint of deism. Oh my God, I love that phrasing, Alex.
Cool. I love the fingerprints of deism. Is awesome too. I never thought about that. I love it.
Yeah. To me, in like sociological terms, you have things like intrinsic religiosity, you have extrinsic religiosity, and they now have like something what I consider myself to have is a quest religiosity. Intrinsic religiosity is more so that you see your religion as an end in and of itself. A person that's extrinsically religious, they see their religion as a means to an end. Let's say, not necessarily a vicious end, and vicious means or whatever. It's more, let's say, they see church as a way of getting community and social skills like that. That's sort of extrinsic religiosity. Quest religiosity just sees religion, or in deism case, the pursuit of nature, as a quest in of itself, and seeing God as being the creator of things, being able to find out things about the world makes you appreciate how God made the world.
Yeah, totally.
Just to echo something you said, which it's funny how great minds, or at least the minds in this conversation, think alike. On my profile, I recently put up the phrase "questing for natural law," because if I ever start a podcast, that's what I want to call it. This idea of deism being a heroic call to adventure, I think is a really good one, and it's kind of the way in combination with a reverence for the founding fathers and the deists who had these ideas. I think this idea of deism presenting you with a quest, like you need to contribute to our understanding of natural law. That's your moral obligation, and it's an adventure. It's something that you should be excited to jump into. I think that's really powerful, and if we can come up with a way to kind of turn that into messaging, that feels intuitively to me like it has legs.
Well, let me try to connect what you guys just said, because Brass just said that deism is an intrinsic religiosity. Is that what you said?
I was saying for myself, I consider myself more in the quest-based religiosity,
So does that fall?
where I see.
Well, my question was, is the adventure the end itself? Is I guess what I'm saying.
I mean, it's sort of just an is to it. It's like it's sort of because intrinsic it sees the religion itself as the end, where extrinsic sees the it's like the whole means and ends dynamic doesn't really go into the quest dynamic. It's because it's just the adventure itself. There's not really means or ends attached to it. It's just like going down a road is by itself not an end or a means. It's just an is. It's what you're doing.
Gotcha. But you could frame it as in like the journey is the destination kind of stuff that other people have
And
talked about as well, right?
and certainly, I mean, I would say for a lot of deists, they would probably fall more under the intrinsic brand.
Yeah,
Just
I
from my
agree.
personal, I would say that's mostly, I would see most deists would fall under that. I mean, the way I am though is like I've always been the kind of guy that if everyone is doing one thing, I go out of my way to do the other thing, even if it comes to some price to myself, because I'm just argumentative like that.
Contrarian.
This is my
Yeah,
secret fear about the Deism project, is that maybe the thing that really unites deism is a rejection of authority. So trying to get people to move in lockstep is just going to be impossible because by nature it's herding cats. That's my secret fear, but we'll see.
Well, we have the internet. The internet makes cats herdable.
mhm, yeah. I mean, the internet definitely has helped get the message out there a lot more than before. Because before, I mean, the only chance that you would get to hear about deism before would be you'd have to be an academic and spend thousands of dollars on an education. And even with the academic, you probably only get like a basic run through of it. And you would have to personally yourself go out of your way to buy these $100 books in order to do sufficient research on the topic. But nowadays, a lot of the material is in the public domain. Like all of Thomas Paine's works are in the public domain, so anyone can read them.
Voltaire too.
Yeah, and Voltaire. So that's sort of how. So I mean, that's a good thing that it's easier now to distribute deist information than it was ever before in the past because you essentially had to be an academic. Like 200 years ago, that was pretty much the only way you would hear about it. You'd have to be an academic, and you would have to be an academic or you'd have to be someone that's at least closely around academics and you'd have to overhear them talking about it.
Yeah, I think Thomas Jefferson exemplifies what you're talking about. I don't know if you ever read about his invention where he sat down and he had this like desk with that had multiple layers and it had hinges and he could attach books to it so he could have like different layers in front of him and have like be working with 10 books at once. I think that's kind of like an image of what you're talking about.
Well, just remember if you're in a swivel chair, that was made by Thomas Jefferson.
Nice. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yep. I mean, out of all the things that you could be known for inventing, that's the one thing that I think, was revolutionary.
It's hard to be against swivel chairs.
Yeah, pretty much. I do remember when I go over through the history, because when you go into ethics, like there's a couple of topics that are inevitably going to come up. Mostly, it's always going to be Hitler, and it's going to be Hitler and slavery, because that's like the main. For some reason, those are the two topics people generally like to bring up.
Godwin's law.
And yeah, what I find funny also is like people like that when they're dealing with the problem of evil, people will say, "Well, why did God?" And I sometimes I'm a snarky person by nature, and so people will say, "Well, why did God allow the Holocaust?" And I say, "Oh, well, so that we would have something to point in our moral discussions to an evil."
Oh my gosh.
That'll get a reaction.
Yeah, it's like, before, like, what would we point to, like, to define evil? Like, what, Genghis Khan, maybe? And so, yeah, that's why the Holocaust happened. God just really wanted to be helpful in our philosophical discussions and said, all right, here's the perfect exemplary of evil right here. So now you guys are set for your philosophical
Yeah,
discussions.
it is. It's funny because it's a snarky comment, but there's an interesting underlying truth there, which is, in a society that's increasingly diverse, let's say, in its moral foundations, meaning, some people are theists and some people are atheists, and they just disagree about what morality is on a fundamental level. Increasingly, what we seem to do is just grab on to these landmark examples that we all agree are wrong, because we at least know we agree about that. We might not agree why they're wrong. We might be consequentialists and deontologists or not even have thought about it, but we can agree that it is wrong. And we can create consensus that way, even if we weren't able to agree on the actual kind of like moral philosophy, as it were, which is interesting because in previous societies, I think people actually had more foundational agreement where they had a shared belief system, so they kind of knew why
Yeah.
they agreed that something was right or wrong.
Well, a thing that I also like to point out to people, because there is a sort of, how you could say, I mean, obviously this applies to myself. I'm not here to make myself seem like I'm better than anyone else, but I do at least try to acknowledge like some of the sociological and psychological factors of humans. Like myself, and I see myself doing this too, but it's like people really like this to have this idea that what we're going through as a culture is specifically unique to us in every single way, and no one from the past has had any sort of thing that was like what we gone through. Like a common thing I hear about people, like especially conservatives, will say is, "We've never been more politically divided than what we are right now." And I said, "You do realize we had a civil war?"
Yeah, absolutely.
We were fairly divided at that point.
Well, not only that, but
Yeah,
that's still to this day the war that America has lost the most soldiers in.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's what's going to happen if you have people from essentially the same country fighting each other.
And that's saying
Because
something
I
when you
mean,
got
what
World
else?
War One and World War Two that it's competing with.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, the difference is like when you have World War I and II. I mean, you're killing people from other nations, whereas with a civil war, you're just killing everyone in one nation.
Yeah, and a lot of the times when America's in a war and the casualty count is low, it's because we're doing really well. But that doesn't really apply in a civil
Yeah,
war because, yeah, obvious reasons.
You can't really do well.
No, there's no doing
yeah.
well.
Um, what I've always found interesting when it comes to, like, it goes over the 14th Amendment talk. I hear a lot of people, like people that I otherwise agree with when it comes to politics, they really want, let's say, the 14th Amendment to be interpreted in an egalitarian way. And they really do want that and from just a purely historical standpoint, I just don't see it. Because, like I said before, you had you had discrimination laws that were in place before, during, and after the 14th Amendment was made. And none of the people that were discussing or even going over the amendments had any inkling that what they were doing was contradictory.
I mean,
So
so I'm endlessly quoting Scalia here, but he used to talk about this. There's a TV show called "There Ought to Be a Law," right? And the idea was that you'd say something like, "Oh man, that's terrible. There ought to be a law against that," right? It was like a kind of like a slogan from a bygone era, and
yeah,
these days people take it one step further. They say there ought to be a law, so they look at the Constitution and say, "And by golly, there is." You know, like there's a ton of stuff that I think is a good idea. That doesn't mean the Constitution says it's a right. So, like,
well, yeah,
pass a law. Like, there's a lot
yeah,
of stuff that you can pass a law about, and then pass a law, and then it's the law. You don't. It doesn't need to be a constitutional right. The reason that you're trying to get it litigated is because you don't have the votes to make it a law. So instead, you're trying to bypass the democratic process and have the judges make it the law for you. And I just don't think that's how the system is designed to work.
yeah. I mean, for one, that puts a lot of undue power onto judges because you're essentially making judges like the be all
You're
end
making them
all.
kings.
Yeah, pretty much. And I mean, said now, I believe if you truly believe in an idea and it's not currently in the Constitution, then look, we have ways of making new amendments. It's hard and it's tedious, and you know there have been tons of failed amendments, but it's a system nonetheless. If you truly believe in your idea, there is already a system in place to put those things in if you have the support.
So, at the risk of doing more story time, the moment
Yeah,
I discovered, to my great chagrin, that I was an originalist, I was uh, I was in Paris, which is a great place to be, and I don't know if you know this decision, but the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell, which is the case that made gay marriage legal in America, came out. And
yeah,
I hadn't read it yet, but I was in Europe, and I was still in law school, so I wasn't a lawyer yet. And I was thinking, God, I have a lot of gay friends. I have friends who couldn't get married and now they can. I have gay family members. I was very pro the outcome. So I was so
so
proud that my class of people, lawyers like me, had made this happen. And I felt very proud. And I was sitting there in France about being an American lawyer. And then I read the decision, and the decision is just a pile of hot garbage, legally speaking. There's nothing in it that even resembles legal analysis. It's just very high-minded language about what is good and noble and true. And that's just not what lawyers are supposed to be doing. And I was so disappointed. And again, I liked the outcome. I just didn't think that it was legal, like the reasoning wasn't there.
yeah,
And then I read Scalia's dissent. And I don't want to read the whole thing, but there's just one paragraph at the very beginning, which just blew me away, where he writes, um, the substance of today's decree is not of immense personal importance to me. The law can recognize as marriage whatever sexual attachments and living arrangements it wishes, and can afford them favorable civil consequences, from tax treatments to rights of inheritance. Those civil consequences and the public approval that conferring the name of marriage evidences can perhaps have adverse social effects, but no more adverse than the effects of many other controversial laws. So it is not of special importance to me what the law says about marriage. It is of overwhelming importance, however, who it is that rules me. Today's decree says that my ruler, and the ruler of 320 million Americans coast to coast, is a majority of the 9 lawyers on the Supreme Court. The opinion in these cases is the furthest extension, in fact, and the furthest extension one can imagine, of the court's claimed power to create quote unquote liberties that the Constitution and the amendments neglect to mention. This practice of constitutional revision by an unelected committee of 9, always accompanied, as it is today, by extravagant praise of liberty, robs the people of the most important liberty they asserted in the Declaration of Independence and won in the Revolution of 1776, the freedom to govern themselves. I mean, I was just fucking floored by that paragraph. So anytime I have an opportunity to bring it up, I do. So
Yeah. And for me personally, I've always made the jokes about it. Like, I've supported gay marriage my entire life. So there's never been a time where I wasn't supporting of it. And to be quite frank, I'm at this point where I say, look, if you hate gay people, let them get married.
That's nice.
Because I mean, like I say, if you really hate gay people and you don't want to see them in love and happy, let them get married. And I said that's funny about that is, to me, this entire discussion of marriage. I mean, let's put it this way: the only reasons why we have the government so involved in our marriage lives is because, for two things: polygamy and misintegration, like race mixing. That's basically the reasons why we have the government involved in it, is because, for one, they had passed anti-bigamy laws where they were against the Mormons and them having polygamous relationships. So the government stepped in and declared basically that polygamy was against the law, or that they wouldn't recognize polygamy as a real marriage. And they also created, like, they also wanted to have licenses so that they can make sure that only, like, white people were only marrying white people and black people were only marrying black people. And there wasn't race mixing, so they could keep a tab on that. So when you take that into consideration, the fact of the matter is, when the founding fathers were in America and they were doing their thing, they didn't have the government involved in their lives, their marriage lives like this. Basically, you got married in your community. The only people that knew that you were married was your family, and that was it.
I mean, this is Destiny said this to me when we were talking. He said to me, like, what do you think the founding fathers would have thought of a president who was immune to federal prosecution? And I said, the founding fathers would have been stunned that there was such thing as federal prosecution. They didn't believe that there was a federal police force. Like, this is, the idea that the federal government was so extensive that it was regulating marriage was unheard of in that era. That's clearly something that was left to the states. And it only became a federal issue because we've had some decisions that really expanded federal power because of Commerce Clause and a bunch of other stuff. But I mean, it has as much to do with tax brackets as anything else these days. So yeah, it's a little bit of an ass backwards policy, but you can't, you don't write on a blank slate. What are you going to do?
Yeah, pretty much. And that is sort of like, I mean, I like to just go into the history of it, which is funny. Like, I've not really noticed many, because you would think liberals, of all people, that are very keen on going back to the past and seeing how debaucherous, like, any practice that we currently practice really originated from. Like, none of them, like, there are a couple, I grant that, but most of them do not go that route when it comes to marriage. And I mean, there was plenty of, like, there was anti-Mormon bigotry that was going on because they didn't like the polygamy, and they also just didn't want race mixing. And so those basic things are part of the reason why and obviously the government just wants to grow in power anyway, so you can make the argument that the polygamy and the race mixing issue just was an excuse for the government to do what they already wanted to do to begin with, which I'm open to that suggestion. But that is sort of where a lot of the intrusion comes into it.
It's fascinating. It's kind of depressing, but fascinating.
That is history for you.
Yep.
Yeah. Me and my law school buddies like to joke that the alternative name for constitutional law is the history of American racism, because 99% of the decisions are pretty brutal, and you'll see some stuff that's in there that is from a different era, let's say. Uh,
Yeah.
but that's the nice thing about being a natural law theorist instead of a theist. We don't have to pretend that people in the past had everything perfect. More just that
Yeah.
they had laid a very useful foundation.
Yeah. I mean, and it is just sort of funny how it is. Like, I mean, even with Thomas Paine was a more liberal dude, you could say. He was even progressive in many senses because he believed. I'm trying to think. I can't remember what his name. He believed in universal basic income back in his day. He's the first American to suggest it.
Whoa, that's
And
crazy.
yeah, I mean, Thomas Paine was pretty much as liberal as you could get on many issues. But even back then, like, you can obviously see that he had racism and anti-Semitism beliefs. Because, I mean, sadly, that was just a common thing back then.
Oh yeah,
definitely.
of course.
I mean, and here's the thing. I think more so that, like, and I say, like, sincerely, as a guy that loves Thomas Paine, that, like, I can fully admit where the guy was wrong at in terms of his moral beliefs. But I say, look, I say personally, his moral arguments, like, I believe if he would have taken more care into looking into them, he would eventually find that what his beliefs were contrary to what he was putting out there. And we sort of now have the benefit where we could look back at that and say, well, yeah, he should have taken these principles to their logical conclusion and not had those beliefs that he did.
No.
But I mean,
you can't judge historical figures by modern standards in this way. It doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't know if you guys know who Justice Harlan was, but before Brown v. Board of Education, which is the case that desegregated American schools, there was a prior case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that said separate but equal is okay. That got overruled by Brown versus Board of Education. And the only judge on the Supreme Court who dissented in Plessy and said, actually, that's not okay. So obviously the one who was most in tune with modern ideals in that sense was Justice Harlan. So he was obviously kind of ahead of his time in that sense. And he wrote this incredible dissent talking about why Plessy is wrong and all these incredible things and why we shouldn't have segregated schools and why you shouldn't have black people separate from white people, etc. And everyone applauds. But then if you keep reading, he gets to the end and he goes, quote, this is a direct quote, "But there is a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. Ellipses. I allude to the Chinese race." So,
jeez.
You said, like, you know what I mean? Like, he was the most progressive person on the court in terms of race relations at his era, but was wildly racist by today's standards. And that's because time only runs in one direction. Like he was essentially an abolitionist, but he still wouldn't pass today's test.
Yeah. And, well, I mean, the thing is that, I mean, to me, it's not so much that you can't judge them by today's standards, but it's more so that you have to I like to compare it, because we do study, like, epistemology, and there is such a thing as moral accountability and epistemic accountability. I sort of combine, like, I see these two as pairings to each other, where, like, to give an example, for like for example, for throughout all the ancient world, really, people believed that the the sun revolved around the earth. They were geocentric, and they believed the sun went around the earth instead of the opposite way around. Like that was Aristotle's view. And here's the thing: at Aristotle's time, that was simply the best information you could have. That was the agreed upon position that was based on all the available tools that they had at the time and all the available math. Now, obviously, today, we can obviously say that they were wrong on that front, but we're not going to hold it against them for the fact that they came to the wrong answer. Sort of like that, I go with morals, where you can judge them by today's standard, but you have to realize, you have to take into consideration what was the information that they had at the time. And sadly speaking, for many of them, they grew up in a racial environment that was not egalitarian like it is today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. That human knowledge, didn't begin. We didn't begin with the perfect book that gave us all the answers. We had to fight for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's sort of how I get it. There's one thing between blaming a people for, I mean, there's a difference between acknowledging they came to the wrong conclusion and saying, oh, we're going to personally blame them for the fact that they came to the wrong conclusion. Those are two separate things.
Totally. Yeah. Hey, gents, I'm looking at the clock, and unfortunately, I am going to have to call it pretty soon because of work obligations in the morning.
All right.
But Brass,
All right.
man, thank you so much for joining, and I feel like this was really productive.
Yeah,
I have a
me
lot
too.
of ideas about how to carry things forward, and I think there's some to-do lists here. So, Brass, if you wouldn't mind circulating that or making that list you have available, I would be eternally grateful. And what I would suggest
All right.
is I'm going to, well, let me not suggest. Alex asked earlier if I can make the recording of this space public, at least within our group. And I'm going to try to do so. I've never done that on X before, so hopefully it's not deleted. But I'd like to keep a record of these ideas because I think we had some good ones here. And I'd like to start thinking about ways that we can start, actualizing them in the time to come.
Well,
Yeah.
one
I think we've got a lot of good topics. Well, yeah, I know that you're busy because you're gonna have to bail Destiny out of his predicament, but yeah.
I wanted to suggest in the future doing this kind of thing in a public space, because I feel like it would be like a good practice for the podcast environment. And it's not just the podcast environment; it's also like spaces are essentially kind of like call-in shows too. So it's like having an audience and then being able to have audience participation. All that is something that I'm interested in. I'm interested in growing my account and getting more followers and getting more people, just being connected to more people, increasing the reach. And I'm sure you guys are too, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And keeping this one in-house to make sure that we were aligned on kind of like internal ideas and kind of processes, I think made sense. But in the future, I think we should try to open these up and see if we can, get some more people involved in the conversation. Totally agree.
With deism as a flag, right? Essentially, it being the flagship idea that we're going with.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I gotta go myself. I'm gonna get me a drink. I currently do voiceovers for a video game, and I had to do a deep voice, and that sort of drained my voice as well.
That's a cool job, though.
Yeah. All right. Well, you guys have a nice time. I hope we get to do something like this more often.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great meeting you, Brass.
I think it's fantastic, and it's. I'm just amazed that I thought I was the only deist on X, and it turns out that we have a whole caliphate. So who knew?
Yep. All right. So you guys have a nice night.
Night all.
You too. Thanks for all the amazing insights, dude. Awesome.
Cheers.
All right. See you later, dudes.